The year was 1945. Across Germany, cities burned like dying embers. The Reich was collapsing. Streets once filled with parades and promises now echoed with fear and footsteps. But in one quiet Bavarian town, nestled between the misty hills and a river swollen with melted snow, Mayor Wilhelm Keller still signed his papers in neat blue ink every morning. He wrote not as a politician, but as a witness. Hidden behind the false bottom of his oak desk lay a small leather-bound diary, one that would never be stamped or censured by the regime. Every night, as air raid sirens screamed in the distance, Keller documented the slow unraveling of his world, his town's last days under Nazi control. The diary began in late March. Our banners hang in tatters. Children march with wooden rifles. The soldiers pass through without eyes, without faces. The radio says victory still, but our bells ring for funerals. Keller was not a hero. He had worn the armband, attended the meetings, given the speeches. But now, as the war neared its end, he saw something that frightened him more than defeat: truth. He saw boys drafted at 14, mothers begging for bread, officers looting what they had sworn to protect. Every evening, the mayor would walk through the cobblestone square, past the shuttered bakery, the silent church, and the cracked statue of the Führer. He would look up at the sky and listen. Somewhere beyond the mountains, the thunder of American artillery grew louder each day. He tried to maintain order. Rationed cards were distributed. The town's last horse was requisitioned for transport. Soldiers dug trenches in the fields, pretending it would make a difference. But in the faces of his townspeople, bakers, blacksmiths, widows, he saw exhaustion deeper than fear. One evening, Keller gathered his small council in the Rathaus basement. A single oil lamp flickered, shadows trembling across the walls. "Gentlemen," he said, voice low, "the Americans will be here soon. We have two choices: fight and be destroyed, or surrender and save what's left." A silence followed. Then an old teacher, once proud in uniform, whispered, "They'll call it treason." Keller looked at him and replied, "And yet, it may be our last act of humanity." That night, he returned home, his steps heavy on the worn wooden floor. His wife, Marta, waited at the kitchen table, hands trembling around a cup of cold coffee. "You'll lose everything," she said quietly. He nodded. "Then let me lose it for something honest." He opened his diary and wrote again, his handwriting unsteady. "Tomorrow I will send word. We will not fight. Let history judge me, not the dead."
Outside, distant flashes lit the horizon, silent, ghostly lightning from the approaching front. The war was coming. And in that tiny Bavarian town, a mayor's pen became his weapon. April 12, 1945. The morning began with frost and ended with fire. From his office window, Mayor Keller saw the smoke of burning villages far beyond the valley. The horizon pulsed with dull red light, as if the sky itself was bleeding. The American forces were moving fast, mechanized columns rolling through the countryside, swallowing towns one by one. The radio still spat out propaganda about final victory, but even the officers no longer believed it. Inside the mayor's study, the air smelled of ink, dust, and candle wax. Keller sat hunched over his desk, the pages of his hidden diary open before him. His handwriting trembled as he wrote, "It is the 12th day of April. The Führer speaks of miracles, but I see none. Our soldiers are shadows, our leaders ghosts. The town still pretends to stand proud, but fear has entered every home. I can hear it in the silence." The town square, once full of laughter and Sunday bells, was now a graveyard of propaganda posters. Torn faces of generals stared from cracked walls, slogans half erased by the rain. The church doors were locked, its priest missing since last week. Rumors said he had been taken by the SS for preaching surrender. Others whispered he had fled with forged papers. Keller still performed his duties, Each day, villagers came to him, mothers begging for bread, fathers pleading for their sons to be spared from conscription. "Please, Herr Bürgermeister," they said. "He is only 16. Keller would nod, pretending to check lists, but there were no lists anymore. There was only chaos, disguised as command. He had learned to lie softly, to promise hope where none existed. "The war will end soon. Just hold on a little longer." But his eyes betrayed him, tired and red from sleepless nights. At dusk, the first American reconnaissance planes flew low over the valley. Their engines rumbled like distant thunder, scattering the crows from the rooftops. Children pointed at the sky, and the old men in the square said nothing. They simply watched, knowing that history was changing above them. That evening, Keller called an emergency meeting with his town council. Only 4 men came. The rest had fled or hidden. They gathered in the cellar beneath the outhouse, the candlelight flickering against stone walls that had seen centuries of peace and war. "Tomorrow," Keller began, "the Americans will arrive." He spread a rough map across the table. "We have no ammunition. Our anti-air guns were taken to Munich. If we resist, they will shell the town. Every house, every family. Gone."
An officer, gaunt and pale, slammed his fists against the wood. "You speak of surrender? That is death for all of us. The SS will hang you before the Americans even reach the gates." Keller met his eyes. "If the SS arrives first, yes. If the Americans arrive first, perhaps not. But if we fight, this town will vanish in an hour." The silence that followed was unbearable. They could hear the ticking of a single clock upstairs, muffled by the thick walls. Finally, the teacher, the same man who once whispered of treason, spoke again. "You're right. This town has blood enough." Keller nodded. "Then we act before dawn." He left the cellar with the weight of 1,000 lives pressing on his shoulders. The night air was cold and heavy, carrying the faint scent of smoke. Somewhere in the distance, artillery boomed, deep, rhythmic, closer each hour. At home, Marta waited by the window. She didn't ask what had been decided. She could see it in his face. "They'll call you a traitor," she said softly. "Then I'll be one, for the sake of those who can't defend themselves." He opened his diary once more, hands trembling as he wrote, "I do not know if I will live to see the peace that follows. But if anyone ever finds these pages, let them know this. I did not surrender for fear, but for mercy. I chose to save what was left of us." Outside, the wind carried the distant sounds of war, a metallic growl that rose and fell like the breath of something immense and unstoppable. The last train had left the station hours ago, its whistle fading into the night. Keller closed the diary, blew out the candle, and sat in darkness. Tomorrow, he would gamble everything on a single act of defiance, the refusal to fight. The town slept uneasily. Dogs barked at the unseen horizon. Somewhere beyond the fields, the engines of the advancing Americans rumbled like the heartbeats of the future. And as midnight passed, Keller whispered to himself, "Let the world remember us not for how we fought, but for how we stopped fighting." The dawn of April 13th, 1945 arrived without birdsong. The town awoke to a silence so deep that even the wind seemed afraid to move. Over the eastern ridge, a pale light broke through the smoke, revealing a valley stripped bare by winter and war. Mayor Wilhelm Keller stood at his window, buttoning the same gray coat he had worn for 5 years. His reflection in the glass looked older than he remembered, lined, hollow-eyed, the face of a man who had spent too long making impossible choices. The streets below were ghostly. Soldiers had abandoned their posts. The Nazi banners on the Rathaus facade fluttered weakly, their edges burned. Across the square, the baker's wife carried water to her doorstep. She didn't look up, didn't wave.
Everyone seemed to move carefully, as if afraid to disturb the fragile balance between survival and destruction. Mayer turned to his wife. "It's time."
She said nothing, just walked to the cupboard, removed a folded white bedsheet, and handed it to him. It smelled faintly of lavender and smoke. He understood without words. That white cloth would become the town's last message. We surrender. He walked through the empty corridors of the roundhouse, his boots echoing softly. On his desk, the diary lay open, a single, unfinished line scrawled across the page. Perhaps tomorrow, peace will enter this room. He closed it, gently, and placed it inside the drawer, covering it with ledgers and ration lists. Then, taking the sheet and a wooden pole, he climbed the narrow stairs to the roof. The wind up there was sharp, tasting of ash. Keller tied the cloth to the pole and raised it high above the bell tower. For a moment it hesitated, then unfurled, a white flag fluttering against a sky still bruised with the smoke of war. Down below, townspeople saw it. Some gasped, some wept, some crossed themselves. The signal was unmistakable. The mayor had chosen surrender. But not everyone approved. From the far end of the square came the clatter of boots, a squad of German soldiers, their uniforms muddied, their eyes hard. At their head marched Lieutenant Gerhard Weiss, a young officer barely 30, fanatical, desperate. His men halted before the roundhouse. Weiss shouted up, "Mayor Keller, you will remove that flag immediately." Keller stepped onto the balcony. "Lieutenant, the Americans are less than 10 kilometers away. Fighting now will destroy everything. This town has no weapons left, no soldiers, only families. He cut him off. "You are a traitor, an enemy of the Reich." He turned to his men. "Arrest him." Two soldiers hesitated, glancing at each other. The madness of obedience had begun to crumble. One muttered, "Sir, the war's over, you know it." Weiss's face twisted. "The war is never over, not while we breathe." Keller stood his ground. "And yet your Führer hides in a bunker. Berlin burns. What are you still fighting for?" The square had fallen silent. From the windows, townsfolk watched, frozen between fear and hope. Weiss drew his pistol and aimed it at Keller's chest. Marta screamed from the crowd, "Wilhelm!" The sound broke something in the lieutenant. His hand trembled. His men didn't move. Then, from the distance, came a low, rolling sound, the rumble of tanks. The Americans had arrived. Weiss froze, listening. The ground itself seemed to hum. One of his soldiers whispered, "Sir, that's them." Weiss lowered his gun slowly, eyes darting toward the hills. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then he barked a curse, turned and ran. His men followed, scattering down the streets like frightened ghosts. Keller exhaled, shaking. The pistol still gleamed on the cobblestones where Weiss had dropped it. Moments later, the first American jeeps rolled into the square. Soldiers in dusty uniforms, helmets tilted low, rifles raised cautiously. One of them, a young lieutenant with kind eyes, saw the white flag and ordered his men to stand down. "Civilians, you're safe now," he called out. Keller stepped forward, his voice steady despite the tremor in his chest. "We surrender the town. There will be no resistance." The lieutenant nodded, lowering his weapon. "Then you've saved a lot of lives today, sir." The mayor looked around at his people, huddled, tearful, stunned. "No," he said quietly, They saved me. The Americans began distributing food and medical aid. For the first time in years, the air no longer smelled of fear, but of fresh bread and diesel. The church bells rang, softly, hesitantly, as if it was testing whether it was allowed to ring for peace again. That night, Wilhelm Keller returned to his office. The white flag still fluttered in the dark, glowing faintly in the moonlight. He sat down, reopened his diary, and wrote, "Today, the war ended here, not with victory, but with mercy. May the world never forget that peace began with a white flag." He put down his pen, his hands trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion and relief. Outside, the tanks moved on toward Munich, their engines fading into the distance. The town, once marked for destruction, had survived by the courage of one man who chose surrender over pride. And in his diary, hidden once more under the desk, history waited to be found. The morning after the surrender, the town awoke to a new kind of silence, one not born from fear, but from disbelief. For the first time in years, there were no sirens, no speeches, no marching boots, only the sounds of life returning. The creak of shutters opening, the soft clang of a church bell, the hesitant laughter of children who had not yet learned what peace truly meant. Mayor Wilhelm Keller walked through the streets, the same streets he had crossed countless times, but today every corner felt changed, lighter somehow, though haunted by the ghosts of yesterday. American soldiers stood by the fountain in the square, speaking softly amongst themselves, their strange accents mixing with the smell of fresh bread and oil. One of them, a young private from Ohio named James Porter, waved as Keller passed. "Morning, sir. The colonel wants to thank you personally later. Says this town's lucky to have you." Keller nodded, offering a faint smile. "Luck has little to do with it, I think. Only exhaustion." He stopped by the church. The door, once barred by the Gestapo, stood open. Inside, candles flickered before a crocked statue of Christ. The priest, gaunt but alive, knelt in prayer. When he saw Keller, he rose and whispered, "You did what I could not."
Keller shook his head. "No, Father. I only wrote what others were too afraid to say." That afternoon, American officers held a brief assembly in the square. The townspeople gathered nervously as the colonel spoke through an interpreter. "This town is now under Allied protection. No harm will come to you. You are free to rebuild." The words, "You are free," rippled through the crowd like sunlight breaking through strong clouds. Some wept openly. Others simply stood, silent, absorbing the meaning. Marcia, watching from the steps of the Rathaus, let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. But even peace carried shadows. That night, as the Americans set up camp outside town, Keller sat again at his desk. The candle burned low, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. He opened his diary, its pages now swollen with ink and truth, and began to write once more. "The war has ended here, but I fear its ghosts will linger. Today, a woman spat at me in the market. She called me a coward. Perhaps she is right. Perhaps mercy looks like weakness to those who only learned strength through suffering. Yet I cannot regret what I've done." He paused, listening to the faint hum of an American generator outside. For years, that hum had been the sound of the enemy. Now it was the heartbeat of safety. Still, not everyone accepted the peace. In the corners of the town, small acts of resentment flared. Graffiti on the walls, whispers about collaboration, accusations traded like currency. A young soldier's widow shouted at Keller one morning,
My husband died for the fatherland. You surrendered it. He answered softly, Your husband died because others could not surrender soon enough. The woman turned away, weeping. Days passed. The Americans distributed food and medicine, set up field hospitals, repaired the bridge that had been blown up by retreating German troops. Slowly, the fear began to fade. Children returned to school. The bells rang freely again. But Keller could feel the weight of judgment pressing against him. Even as life returned, the townsfolk looked at him with uncertain eyes, gratitude mixed with suspicion. To some, he was a savior. To others, a traitor. Then came the knock. It was late evening when an American officer entered his office. Colonel Robert Hayes, a man in his 40s, calm and direct. Mr. Keller, he said, we're compiling reports on local governance during the war. The military administration will need statements, yours especially. Keller nodded slowly. I will give you what I can, Colonel, but my record is incomplete, intentionally so. Hayes studied him for a moment. They told me you kept a diary. Keller's eyes flicked toward the drawer. I did, but it's not an official record. It's just truth. And truth is dangerous. The colonel smiled faintly. Sometimes, the dangerous truths are the ones worth keeping.
When Hayes left, Keller sat for a long while, staring at the drawer. His hand hovered over it. Should he give it to them? Should he hide it forever? The diary wasn't just words. It was confession, witness, guilt, and salvation bound in leather. Finally, he whispered to himself, "Let the next world decide." He sealed the diary in wax, wrapped it in brown paper, and hid it once more behind the false panel of his desk. Outside, the wind had changed. The spring air carried the scent of rain and freshly turned earth, the smell of things beginning again. And for the first time in years, Mayor Wilhelm Keller allowed himself to sleep without dreams. It was the spring of 1965, and the town of Gernbach had changed beyond recognition. New houses stood where ruins once were. Children rode bicycles through streets that had once echoed with marching boots. The war had become a story, something the older generation whispered about when they thought no one was listening. But history, like truth, never stays buried forever. In the attic of the old Rathaus, now half museum, half municipal archive, a young historian named Anna Keller, granddaughter of the late mayor, carefully sorted through dusty crates of documents. The air smelled of parchment and time. She had never met her grandfather. He died before she was born. To her, he was only a name on a plaque near the town fountain, Mayor Wilhelm Keller, defender of Gernbach. But among the yellowed papers and brittle letters, she found something else. A false panel in the back of a drawer, and behind it, wrapped in brown paper, sealed with red wax, a leather-bound diary. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was elegant, deliberate. The night I chose surrender, I killed a war and saved a town. Anna's breath caught. She turned the pages, reading line after line, entries of doubt, fear, and desperate morality. He had written everything: the hunger of the people, the silence of the church, the cruelty of the SS, the decision that changed everything. Hours passed. Outside, the bells rang noon, but inside the archive, time itself seemed to stop. She reached the final page. It read, "If anyone should find these words, know that I did not seek to be remembered, only to make peace in a world that had forgotten how. If peace has endured, then I have not lived in vain."
Tears blurred her vision. This wasn't just a document. It was a confession, a legacy,
and a wound healed too late. She took the diary to the museum curator, an old man who had known Wilhelm as a boy. When he read a few lines, he set his glasses down and whispered, "So he did it. All this time, he never told anyone." Within weeks, the story spread across Germany. Newspapers ran headlines. Mayer's secret diary reveals truth behind Gernbach's surrender. Historians came, journalists came. Survivors who had once cursed his name came too, now standing before his grave with flowers and silence. Some still called him a coward. Most called him a hero. But to Anna, he was simply a man who carried the unbearable weight of mercy. On the anniversary of the surrender, she organized a small ceremony in the town square, the same square where, 2 decades earlier, her grandfather had faced his people under a white flag. She read his final words aloud before the gathered crowd. The wind blew gently, carrying the sound across the cobblestones and through the alleys of the reborn town. Peace is not won by victory. It is won by courage, the courage to stop fighting. The audience stood silent, even the children understood. As dusk fell, Anna looked toward the horizon, the same sky her grandfather had once watched as bombers vanished into the distance. And for a fleeting moment, she felt as if he was there beside her, watching the peace he had bought with his name. The bell rang once more, solemn and clear. And Gernbach, the town that once surrendered, finally found its honor again. Summer came to Gernbach that year, golden and warm, as if the land itself had decided to forgive. But forgiveness, as Anna soon learned, is never simple. The diary's publication had made her family famous and infamous. TV crews arrived with bright lights and polite smiles, wanting interviews. Old soldiers came too, some limping, some bitter, each carrying ghosts of their own. One afternoon, a man arrived unannounced. His uniform was gone, but his bearing remained unmistakably military. Rigid posture, eyes like cold iron. "I was with the SS police regiment east of the river," he said. "I came to speak of your grandfather." Anna tensed, unsure whether to offer him a seat. He didn't wait for one. "He deceived us," the man continued. "He sent false reports, radio silence. We thought the town was holding until the last man. When we arrived, it was gone, empty, surrendered." His tone was not angry, only weary. "I lost half my men retreating from a battle that never happened."
Anna's throat felt dry. "He saved lives," she whispered. "Maybe," the man said, looking out the window toward the rebuilt church. "Maybe he just moved the death elsewhere." He left without saying another word. That night, Anna couldn't sleep. The pages of the diary replayed in her mind. The trembling handwriting, the moral questions without answers. To save some, I must condemn others. To silence the guns here, I must hear them louder elsewhere. For the first time, she understood the unbearable complexity her grandfather had faced. There were no heroes or villains in those pages, only humans, trying to make sense of a collapsing world. Weeks later, a historian from Munich visited her. He was preparing a documentary, piecing together the final German collapses in '45, the small towns that surrendered without orders. "I've read many diaries, but your grandfather's, it's different. It's not strategy, it's conscience." Anna nodded. "He wrote it for himself, not for the world." The historian smiled faintly, and yet the world needed it. A year passed. Gernbach unveiled a new monument, a single block of pale stone engraved with simple words: "To those who chose peace when war demanded death." No statues, no flags, just silence. As Anna stood there, she noticed an elderly woman laying wildflowers at the base of the stone. The woman turned to her and said softly, "I was a child when he made us hide in the cellar. I remember his voice, calm, certain.
I never knew why we lived when others didn't. Now I do." Her eyes filled with tears. "He wasn't just our mayor, he was our shield." Anna smiled weakly, her heart heavy and full. It struck her then, this monument wasn't only for Wilhelm Keller. It was for every nameless soul who made an impossible choice and carried that silence through the rest of their life. That night, as the sun set behind the hills, Anna wrote a final note in the diary's empty last page. "History forgets the ones who surrender, but sometimes surrender is the bravest thing we can do." She closed the book, and for the first time since she'd found it, she didn't feel like crying. The war at last was over, not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of those who remembered it. A cold rain swept across the town square one October evening, smearing the ink on posters announcing the anniversary of Gernbach's surrender. The museum was quiet now. Tourists gone, lights dimmed. Only Anna remained, sitting at her desk with the diary open beside her.
She wasn't reading this time. She was writing. During her research, she had discovered something curious. An envelope, addressed in the same steady hand as her grandfather's diary, marked for Reich Chancellery, Berlin, April 1945. It had never been sent. The seal was broken, the paper torn, but the message inside was intact, a letter from a dying man to a crumbling empire. To those who still believe victory can be forced from ruin, you are wrong. I have seen the eyes of starving children. I have buried the pride you call patriotism. I no longer fight for your Germany. I fight for the one that must come after you. Anna's hand trembled as she reread it. Her grandfather had tried to warn them, not out of rebellion, but out of humanity. But by the time he wrote this, Berlin was already in flames. She made a decision that night. The diary, the letter, and the town's documents all would be digitized, preserved, and made public. The truth would no longer hide in drawers and dust. Months later, she was invited to a conference in Berlin held in a glass-walled hall that stood where the old government quarter once burned. Historians, politicians, and filmmakers gathered to discuss the morality of surrender. Anna stood behind the podium, her voice calm but steady. "My grandfather was not a soldier. He was a teacher, an artist, a man who loved his town. When faced with madness, he chose reason. When told to fight, he chose life. History has called men heroes for dying in battle, but maybe it's time we honor those who refuse to kill." Her words hung in the air. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Afterwards, an old man approached her. His suit was neat, his medals gleaming faintly in the light. "I was one of the soldiers sent to Gernbach that day," he said quietly. "I remember your grandfather standing there, holding the white flag. He didn't look afraid. He looked relieved. I never forgot his face." He took her hand. "Tell them he was brave." Anna smiled, blinking away tears. "I will," she said. "That's what this story is for." Later that night, she walked alone through the rain-soaked streets of Berlin. The neon lights reflected in puddles where once fires had burned. She felt the weight of history around her, millions of stories buried beneath concrete and silence. And she whispered into the wind, "Grandfather, they finally heard you." Far away in Gernbach, the town bell tolled at midnight. The same bell that had rung on the day of surrender, now echoing across a generation, not as a warning, but as a memory. And in that sound lived every choice, every fear, every moment of mercy that had saved a town from destruction. The fake glory of the empire was long gone, but the quiet courage of one man, that still remained. Years had passed, the world had changed, but Anna's mission never wavered. She had turned her grandfather's diary and the letter that never reached Berlin into a book, a film, and an exhibit that traveled across continents. Audiences sat in dark theaters watching the reconstruction of Gernbach in its final days. They saw the streets emptying, the soldiers advancing, the mayor standing firm with a white flag, and the townspeople huddled in silent fear. Every shot was drawn from her grandfather's meticulous notes, the exact words, gestures, and moments that history had almost lost. In classrooms, students debated the moral choices of war. They questioned orders, considered mercy, and learned that courage was not only measured by the bullets fired, but also by the lives spared. Scholars referenced the diary in studies of wartime ethics. Generations who had never lived through the war were beginning to understand its human cost, not just in numbers, but in quiet, deliberate acts of humanity. One afternoon, Anna returned to Gernbach. The town had rebuilt, its streets alive with laughter and commerce. Yet, beneath the modern buildings, the memory of 1945 remained, etched into the stones, whispered by the wind. She stood in the square where the surrender had taken place. A small plaque now marked the site. Here, mercy held sway over madness. Remember the courage of those who chose life. Anna placed the diary on the bench, open to the last entry. I fought not to win, but to save. Let this town live, and let those who come after know that sometimes the bravest act is to refuse destruction. The wind caught the pages, flipping them gently, as if the town itself were acknowledging the words. She smiled, a mix of sorrow and peace washing over her. Far above, a lone bird circled the square, calling through the afternoon sun. History had finally spoken. The hidden account of one mayor, one town, and one moment of choice would never be forgotten again. In the end, it was not the empires or the armies that endured. It was the story of humanity, courage, and conscience, quietly, persistently surviving the chaos of war.